There's no one more qualified to offer perspective on Indiana's all-time starting five than Don Fischer, the voice of IU basketball for 4+ decades. Don, let's start with Steve Alford. What do you remember most about Steve as a player?
Well, in truth, I could say the same thing about all five of the guys that were selected. But Steve, of course, was one of those people that, aside from the fact that he was a tremendous shooter, he also was mentally tough. He was a guy that Coach Knight put a lot on, expected a lot from, came to Indiana as a four-year starter out of high school basketball in Newcastle, Indiana, where everybody talked about him coming to Indiana for years prior to him getting here, and then, of course, took on all those kinds of expectations and just had a phenomenal career. And without question, one of the great shooters of all time at Indiana University. And like I said, from a mindset perspective, and all these guys were very mentally tough, but Steve was one of the toughest because Coach Knight really put a lot upon him from his very beginnings as a freshman.
Don, some would say that Isiah Thomas's NBA career somewhat eclipsed what he accomplished in Bloomington. How special was Isiah as a Hoosier?
Well, he too was another guy that was highly anticipated coming to Indiana out of St. Joseph's High School in Chicago, and he was one of those guys that you knew was extremely gifted as a player, really understood the game of basketball, and of course everybody lamented the fact that he was only at Indiana for 2 years, so he could have been really special in the record books and all those kinds of things had he stayed. But in the 2 seasons he spent at Indiana, he led Indiana to a Big Ten championship. He led him to a national championship. He was an All-American one of those 2 seasons. He just had everything going for him as a player, and of course he exhibited that when he went to the NBA as one of the all-time greats at that level. So without question, and a lot of people thought that he was the best point guard that Indiana has ever had, and there's a real argument that you could go on and say that he probably was, although Quinn Buckner might have something to say about that.
Great segue, because our list does include 2 members of that 75-76 undefeated national championship team, Quinn Buckner and Scott May. What do you think of, Don, when you think of those 2 guys and that team?
What I think about with Quinn is, without question, probably the best leader that an Indiana basketball program has ever had. He wasn't a great shooter. He was a very good assist man. He was a terrific defensive player. But what stood him out from everybody else in that ball club and just about every basketball team at Indiana that I've seen over my 40-plus years was the fact that he just led not only by example but verbally. He was one of those guys that would come across the timeline, and if everybody wasn't where they were supposed to be, he'd stand there with the ball on his hip and he would say, "You're not where you're supposed to be, go here," or whatever the case may be. He was a coach on the floor, and Coach Knight treated him that way. He expected Quinn to run the show, and he did exactly what Coach Knight expected in his 4 seasons.
Finally, Don, Calvert Chaney, still the Hoosiers' all-time leading scorer. How good was Chaney at simply filling it up, especially during that 92-93 season?
Well, he was exceptional. One of the great shooters at Indiana, one of the great scorers, probably a better way to put it, because he not only was a shooter, he was a scorer as well. And he had a tremendous ability to do what was necessary and rarely forced a shot. I mean, one of those people that just understood the game, understood his role, did what he was supposed to do. He did it very quietly. He was not a boisterous guy. He was not a guy that made or tried to make himself out to be something that he was not, nor was he one of those guys that celebrated after every shot or things like that. He was just a special player in every way, shape, and form. And if you talk to his teammates from that 92-93 team, every single one of them would say he was probably the best teammate that they ever played with.
The legendary voice of Hoosier basketball, Don Fischer, helping offer some perspective on Indiana's all-time starting five. Don, truly appreciate the time today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rick. I appreciate it.